in Texas, in the Texas academic system, Governor Abbott has a direct control over what happens, as was the case with that executive order. Abbott appoints the board of regents for our university system, and university presidents are compelled to follow whatever Abbott dictates. I'm also someone who believes in people power, and we can't take this sitting down. And I feel like at this moment, facing this explicit repression is the moment that people need to stand up. And I feel at this point in time, seeing the blatant disregard for international law, the blatant disregard for civilian life at all, draws very deep lines in the sand. I feel that students and workers need to join democratic institutions. YDSA is one such democratic institution, but I also understand that not all people engaged in the fight against oppression are socialist. Workers and students can join their unions, can join student unions, can join other various democratic organizations that fight on specific issues, whether that be trans rights or migrant justice. And ultimately, I feel that this needs to align itself towards the creation of a new working class party in this country.
Alan Dominguez is a junior studying philosophy at Texas State University. At Texas State, he is the co-chair of the Young Democratic Socialists of America chapter, or the YDSA. Under his leadership, he, in collaboration with several other organizations, have mobilized the San Marcos and Texas State community in support of the Palestinian cause. One of the main contributions of the YDSA, aside from protests, has been its petition in support of squashing GA 44, Governor Greg Abbott's executive order, basically conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or being pro-Palestinian with being anti-Semitic. Alan's perspective on this issue is especially relevant not only when it comes to understanding the advocacy scene in San Marcos, but when it comes to understanding the motivations for why someone who may not be so personally attached to the issue, such as a Jewish individual or a Palestinian individual, could spend so much of their time dedicated to mobilizing and advocating. On from Hill Country to the Holy Land, here we've got Alan Dominguez.
Okay, you ready to get started?
Yes.
All right, let's go. So, hi, Alan.
Hi, Zaina.
How you doing?
I'm doing pretty all right.
You're doing pretty all right?
First day back to school.
Awesome. Yeah, it is. Yeah. First day for you. You didn't come to school yesterday?
Oh, no, I was just in the library studying.
Okay, smart. Yeah, smarty pants, right? So, introduce yourself. Tell me who you are, what role you feel like you play in the context of what we're talking about, etc. Just tell me about yourself first.
Yeah, my name is Alan Dominguez. My mom is from Germany, my dad is from Ecuador, and I was born here in Central Texas, and I've lived my whole life here and now going to school at Texas State University. In my first year of joining Texas State University, I joined a student organization called YDSA, or the Young Democratic Socialists of America. And now that I'm a junior in college, I've spent 3 years organizing with that group.
Awesome. And what role does the YDSA have to play in the context of what we're talking about today?
Yeah, YDSA is a national organization, a federated organization of multiple chapters across different colleges and universities. And it's a democratic student organization, meaning that all students can join, and those students make democratic decision-making and elect a leadership specifically to fight on important actions for the working class, whether it be trans rights or migrant justice or workers' wages and conditions.
And so how do you feel Palestine and Israel broadly play into all of this?
I feel like Palestine and Israel are a mirror of the whole imperialist system that we live under. You have rule by might and the dispossession of a people by military and financial power. It's not necessarily just an issue over there, not only for the sense that Texas State has a large amount of international students, a large amount of immigrant students, but also for the simple fact that Israel currently is at a particular point when its financial and political backing is entirely supported and necessarily supported by the United States. So what students do here in the United States is extremely important for what goes on in Israel and Palestine.
Do you feel like people just broadly or in the Texas state community recognize the role the United States has to play when it comes to this conflict? Like, do you think they recognize the extent to which we actually are involved as a country?
Sadly, for this issue, as with many other political issues, there's a sharp divide of people who are extremely engaged, people who are somewhat knowledgeable and somewhat supportive of Palestinian liberation. And there's also an amount of students who are simply very quote unquote pragmatic about going to school and just simply focused on like their individual career that they're going to have after school. I do feel, however, that at Texas State University and in San Marcos, due to the large majority of international students and also due to this being the largest documented genocide ever, that more and more students had been made aware of this, and for the past 17 months, at this point in time, are more supportive of Palestine than they would have been otherwise.
So speaking of, sort of precedent, what this issue was like in the context before October 7th, as people like to sort of frame it in terms of, timeline. First, I just want to talk about October 7th because I feel like, people I've always noticed that in the United States, at least, people like to make parallels between 9/11 and October 7th, and they like to tell their sort of 9/11 stories, what they were doing on 9/11 and how they sort of changed from there. Their life sort of changed from there. First question, do you remember where you were on October 7th? And do you remember having an immediate reaction to what we're seeing now?
I do remember where I was. I was in my apartment, and my immediate reaction was of shock, not necessarily of horror, but more so like a political shock, like as you said, like otherwise, like the precedent had been that Palestine and its military occupation by Israel had been very normalized, and that this was something that was simply in the background of most people's minds. But I see it as like fundamentally different from 9/11 in the sense that like 9/11 was an attack on an entirely civilian population who had nothing to do with the oppression that people in the Middle East are facing, while October 7th, I've heard the best title for it being described as the Gaza ghetto uprising, in the sense that this is a people who have been ghettoized and fenced in for 70 years. And in the US, we've kind of normalized that. But on October 7th, those people broke out of this fenced in jail where their food and their livelihood had been maintained and not maintained by Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that being your perspective, how do you feel that this sort of perspective that October 7th is where it all started? What are your takes on that?
It's extremely disingenuous. An executive order signed in by Governor Greg Abbott 2 years ago this month does exactly this by starting everything on October 7th and framing the military action taken by Palestinian fighters as this sort of random event of violence against an otherwise like victimized people. And it does nothing to explain the colonization, military occupation that people in Gaza and West Bank have been facing. I mean, it's very simple to look just like a map of the last 70 years of Palestine, and that will do more to educate you rather than pretending that thing started on October 7th.
Right. And so you mentioned Governor Abbott, and obviously we're here at Texas State University. We live in Texas. We live in a red state. We live in a blue county, but we do live in a red state. And how do you feel like being a Texan, how do you feel like all of these components frame the sort of Texan consensus on this issue? How do you feel about that?
I'm of the opinion that we live in an undemocratic society, in the sense that Texas is a very multicultural place, and it always has been. There is the tripartite culture of blacks, Latinos, and whites, and now even more so, a concurrent amount of people who live here, not to mention like queer and trans people. In Texas, in the Texas academic system, Governor Abbott has a direct control over what happens, as was the case with that executive order. Abbott appoints the board of regents for our university system, and university presidents are compelled to follow whatever Abbott dictates. For instance, our group, the Young Democratic Socialists of America at Texas State, alongside the Palestinian Solidarity Committee and Muslim Student Association, and even a current sitting member of City Council, Amanda Rodriguez, met with our university president, Kelly Dampus. And his main concern for not being able to protect Palestinian speech was that Abbott had dictated this executive order, and as a university president, he had to follow what Abbott had dictated.
Very interesting. And so you said, and I don't want to misquote you, you said you feel like we don't live in a democratic system?
Absolutely. Not even just in terms of the academic system and the power that Governor Abbott holds, but you have an imperial presidency where Trump can rule by executive order. You have a presidency that's elected by electoral college and not direct one man, one vote. You have a legislative system where AIPAC can funnel as much money as it wants and unseats pro-Palestinian legislators like Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman in the most funded primary of U.S. history.
Right.
Furthermore, it's an entirely undemocratic system.
A little more on AIPAC, because the Israel lobby in the United States, I think we both know, has so much power disproportionate to that of the American people. As an American citizen, how does it make you feel that a foreign government has so much power in our own domestic politics and then foreign policy?
I was very surprised to learn that AIPAC is still not registered as a foreign agent. There was an extreme scandal around Russiagate back in 2016, which turned out to be a farce. And this was the Democratic Party claiming that both Trump and then also Bernie Sanders were propped up by Russia. And this was an extreme scandal for the political elite. However, the constant pressure that the Israel lobby has exercised on not only American politicians, but the American populace goes entirely unchecked. And I feel like, frankly, that's disgusting.
A little bit more on that and how Israel tries to sort of play this domestic role in the United States. There are a lot of narratives that we hear about Israel, such as it being the only democracy in the Middle East, and that as opposed to its neighbors, it cares about gay rights and other sort of human rights issues that might be neglected by Arab Muslim majority countries in the region. What is your take on this sort of narrative, and also how this narrative plays into advocacy for Palestine or for Israel?
An apartheid state can never be classified as a democracy. Israel and Israel supporters also spin this narrative in the United States that to support Palestinian liberation is anti-Semitic. And this is one of the biggest obstacles that supporters of Palestinian liberation face in the United States. I feel like this is very clearly dismissible by the fact that there are many Jewish people who are not Zionist, and that the project of Israel and Jewish supremacy is a Zionist project, not a Jewish project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so going off of that, how do you, as an activist and a leader on one of the biggest campuses in Texas, how do you feel that affects how you can participate in activism?
Personally, I've seen many students, especially international students, fear their safety in participating in activism. I've always had this sense of righteousness, maybe too much so, and I've continued to participate in the YDSA, but I understand students who are fearful because it is ever more an increasing real threat. In the same way that we've seen in Israel, this fascistization of the state and society, where might rules over any sort of law. We see in the United States, as with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, the disappearing of Mahmoud Khalil by ICE, that if you exercise your freedom of speech in a way that is antithetical to the goals of this state, this administration, that you can be disappeared, which is an entirely new phenomena that students and the American populace hasn't faced in many generations, and will very much change our strategy as student activists going forward.
Would you even go as far as to label what we're seeing now as like a modern day McCarthyism?
Absolutely, modern day McCarthyism, and I would say it's the fascistization of state and society. I mean, the Trump-Musk administration is a fascist administration.
Yeah, for sure. And so, this being what we're seeing right now with the arrest and disappearance of Mahmoud Khalil and all of these other issues in terms of free speech, what do you think is next for the YDSA at Texas State?
I feel that this is a moment where we need to draw a line in the sand. I feel that in a sense, the Trump-Musk administration is sort of digging their own grave, not in a deterministic way will this like be the case, but the American populace has not faced such obvious and explicit repression for many generations. And I feel that crucially right now is the moment where students and workers need to draw this line in the sand and say, we're not going to take this, that this is a society in which people flock to for freedom of expression, whether that be religion or political ideas, and it necessarily needs to be so. So I feel for the YDSA, this does entail a strategy of not just civil disobedience in the sense that we accept that this is the norm and we're going to exercise our right to fight this norm, but also for advocating for an entirely new society, a society that is actually democratic.
What do you feel like it's the best next step, the ideal next step in terms of like actualizing that democratic society?
I feel that students and workers need to join democratic institutions. YDSA is one such democratic institution, but I also understand that not all people engaged in the fight against oppression are socialist. Workers and students can join their unions, can join student unions, can join other various democratic organizations that fight on specific issues, whether that be trans rights or migrant justice. And ultimately, I feel that this needs to align itself towards the creation of a new working class party in this country. State power is not absolutely everything, but we see in the United States misrule by two parties. You have a Republican Party that has been entirely hijacked by the fascist right, and you have the Democratic Party, which has completely kowtowed to this. The Democratic Party, in my opinion, has completely failed to offer an alternative. And the few righteous individuals within this party that have tried to fight for Palestinian liberation or fight for workers' rights or fight for a democratic society, such as Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, such as Bernie Sanders, such as Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, are completely sidelined by this party.
Mm-hmm. Right. And how does that make you feel? How do you feel? Do you feel pessimistic? Do you feel optimistic?
I've always considered myself a tragic optimist, and this is something I'm stealing from Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl is someone who survived the Nazi Holocaust, and I see our situation as not so dissimilar. What's going on in Gaza is a genocide that's playing out in real time, and I feel that we need to be sober about what that means. We are experiencing this genocide. We are experiencing fascism. However, I'm also someone who believes in people power, and we can't take this sitting down. And I feel like at this moment, facing this explicit repression is the moment that people need to stand up.
If you could give advice to not only people at, like within the Texas State or San Marcos community, but at universities, throughout Texas, throughout the country, in terms of tangible action they could take, what would those actions be?
Work harder. A lot of students in the United States have a modicum of comfortability in their lives. Whether they be middle or working class, we have a amount of free time that is almost unprecedented in human history. However, we are not actualizing that time and fighting on these issues as hard and as dedicated as we can.
Would you blame social media for that?
Social media, absolutely, but also this entire culture that of like entertainment and opulence, it's just a veneer for not just the oppression that the Palestinians are facing, but for the oppression that the American populace faces. I mean, we have a healthcare system that doesn't work. We have the elderly who are left to die. We have increasing minority populations being targeted for elimination, such as queer people and trans people. We have our freedom of speech being taken away from us. And I think this is why I consider myself like a tragic optimist. We need to be sober about such a dangerous situation, what this is, but we also need to be willing to be dedicated political actors in our everyday lives who are willing to make these changes.
Awesome. Okay. And so we talked already a little bit about what's next for the YDSA. What do you feel like is next for you on an individual basis, on a professional basis, especially in terms of this conflict? What do you feel like is next?
Organizing as large as a united student front as possible. The issue of Palestinian liberation brings a lot of issues together, such as bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, as well as migrant justice. And I feel that YDSA is an organization of class-conscious organizers, but we don't necessarily need every single student to join YDSA for us to make effective political change. What I see myself as doing is bringing students together in the form of mass meetings and mass actions to build our leverage as opposed to going along with the status quo.
And as you do that on an individual basis, on an organizational basis, what are you truly advocating for in terms of a solution for foreign policy, but also what happens in Israel and Palestine?
The U.S. is an imperial power, and I feel that it's up to the American populace that we dictate the bounds of this. I do not feel that we can all of a sudden dissolve the American military's role in upholding imperial power, but we also do have power over how far this goes, such as whether or not the U.S. is propping up Israel and committing a genocide, or whether or not the U.S. can bomb Yemen for supporting Palestine. This is what I mean when I refer to Americans needing to get more serious about the situation and understanding that the power that they already have.
Awesome. And so, is there anything that's on your mind in particular that we maybe haven't covered just yet?
At 2 a.m. local time, Israel resumed its war in Gaza after violating its own ceasefire agreement with Hamas over 300 times. And I feel at this point in time, seeing the blatant disregard for international law, the blatant disregard for civilian life at all, draws very deep lines in the sands. Either you are for the liberation of people from a genocidal regime, or you are complicit in supporting such a regime.
And talking about complicity and also looking at this from a sort of historical perspective, a lot of people like to say, if you want to know what you would have done during Nazi Germany, or if you want to know what you would have done during slavery in the United States, et cetera, do you feel like the severity of the situation now really is the same or compares to those like Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, etc.?
1,000%. We can't project important politics into the past and pretend that this is a moment in time where everyone lives in freedom and we're all fine. This is kind of the veneer of entertainment and opulence that Americans have. But the truth is that not only is there an active genocide on an extreme scale going on in Gaza, and the precepts for the replication of such a genocide in West Bank. But in America, we have an increasingly fascist administration.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you for all of your insights. Again, is there anything else you wanted to add just before we conclude?
No, I think this has been pretty good for me to illuminate some of my own thoughts on the matter too.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alan. Your perspective is very important on this issue, so thank you.
Thank you.